Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derek Heisey. Today's episode is part 5 of my novel, To Make the World Obey. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I strongly recommend you start there. I have left a link to all previous episodes in the description. Last time, the hunt for Temujin's clan began on 2 separate fronts. Detective Deborah Samson, pushing her partner Freddy to his moral limit, finally got a name for her prime suspect, a violent man known as Bartu. Meanwhile, the Friends investigator, Johnny Fava, muscled a lead out of Mr. Greaves' mistress, Jackie, getting a description of the van used by the attackers. But the biggest fissure happened within Temujin's clan itself. Bartu, spiraling from his own sickness, brutally murdered Jackie, and then, upon returning to the warehouse, killed one of his own brothers in a fit of rage. For his crimes, Temujin banished his first brother and right-hand man, leaving Bartu a ghost, alone with his demons. Now that a fresh, brutal murder has put both Johnny Fava and Detective Deborah Samson on the same trail, who will be the first to uncover the truth? What will happen when a stunning coincidence brings Deborah face to face with one of Temujin's most dangerous lieutenants? And as the lines between justice and vengeance blur, will the capture of a monster be worth the devastating price Deborah must pay in both her career and her family? Find out on today's episode of To Make the World Obey. This story is not a gentle darkness. It includes graphic depictions of violence, murder, psychological horror, strong language, and disturbing themes of betrayal and moral decay. It examines the psychology of power in killers and victims alike and explores the way various forms of violence, physical and otherwise, transforms both the inflicted and the witness. If you are sensitive to intense graphic content, this series may not be for you. Now, settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. Mr. Greaves, December 12th, 2024. Mr. Greaves was unaware that the depressions in the snow that he now walked over had been left by Bartu not even 12 hours ago. How could he? Today had the same bleak sky as yesterday, the same chance of snow forecasted, and the same old Damoclean sword hanging lazy and vicious above his head. There was no reason to suspect the wave of dread which swept over him once the elevator opened to Jackie's floor. The antenna of instinct detected the lingering death in the air like a shift in humidity. His own murderous experience detected the blood in the air like the scent of ozone before a rainstorm. Mr. Greaves had not anticipated any of it because he had come, after all, to cash in on the eternal favor which beautiful young Jackie owed him. She was responsible for making him forget the worrisome rust of age and weakness, to gild his rotting world with the lie that he was still the man of which he thought himself. The dread heightened to a dull, distant panic when he sorted through his keys before Jackie's door. The panic whined in his ears like tinnitus after a gunfight, but Mr. Greaves was hardly aware of it. Instead, he only noticed a strange shift in mood, from glum to uneasy, of which he could not quite locate the origin. The old boss wasn't losing his edge. He'd already lost it.
So when he finally found his key and opened the apartment door, he was too consumed with trying to identify the smell to recognize the spatters on the floor and walls, or to notice their color. All he sensed when he entered Jackie's apartment was that something was definitely not right, and that whatever it was brought him back to days 40 years or more ago. It was not an unpleasant sensation.
"Jackie?"
He croaked. He hung up his hat, unwrapped his scarf from his neck, and put up his coat.
"It's me."
No answer came. Mr. Greaves moved deeper into the apartment with a dazed shuffle despite the danger signals he slowly processed. Looking into the kitchen, the red streaks appeared more clearly. He had almost completely registered them when he slipped in blood. He didn't fall. He caught himself on the island countertop, but when he looked at the floor to see what caused the slip, his eyes met with those of Eddie, his captain and old friend. Eddie's eyes were empty and glassy. The bugs were already upon him. He stank.
"Jackie, are you okay?"
In light of the scene he just stumbled upon, it seemed a stupid question, but it was the only one that came to mind. Lou Greaves felt more like a grandfather than a boss these days. Before, he thought he could merge the two into one, compartmentalize the strange nurturing feelings away from the cold, calculated, cutthroat action that was required of him on a daily basis. But now, staring into Eddie's dead eyes with the bugs and the stink, a sense of truth and fatigue overwhelmed him. Greaves left the apartment. His old instincts were not completely atrophied. He went down the elevator, and when he got to his Benz, he just sat in the driver's seat for a while, kneading his forehead and cursing Eddie very quietly. What the fuck had he just walked into? What the fuck had he just walked into? What the fuck had he just walked into? Lou took his glasses off and rubbed his face with both hands. He heaved an enormous sigh, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, it was with the reasoning that it was nothing doing trying to piece it together from his 2-minute experience in the apartment. It was obvious that Eddie had been fucking Jackie behind his back. It seemed stupid now that he'd never picked up on it, and he wondered who else Jackie was fucking. Lou's mind then turned to the next pressing issue. Where the fuck was that broad anyway? Had she done that to Eddie? Had some other lover done it out of jealousy? Had he done it because she'd asked? Lou had lost the plot. He'd lost control of the city to a freak who called himself Peaches. He'd lost the respect of his captains. Steroid lunatic freaks were knocking over his joints. He sighed again. The weight of things almost made him want to cry. But as far back as he could remember, he'd never cried before. He wouldn't now. That, at least, he could keep under control. For a little while, Lou didn't do anything. He didn't move or speak. He just sat in his Benz, breathing in the smell of leather, and stared sightlessly out of the windshield. At last, he growled, "Motherfucker," to no one and nothing, and took out his cell phone. He may have lost control of most of the worm-gut cocksuckers he was supposed to be boss of, but there was at least one naive, hungry starfucker Lou could count on. The phone rang twice before Johnny's somewhat shocked voice came on the other line. "Boss, everything all right?" Johnny Bean, Lou replied. Johnny, I haven't heard from Jackie in a while.
Jackie? Johnny said it like he hadn't heard it right and wanted to make sure.
Yeah, Jackie. One of Cosmo's girls.
Oh, Jackie. I just talked to Jackie the other day, boss. She's fine.
Lou swallowed and blinked. He hadn't been expecting that. He forced himself to keep a level tone and said, I want you to go check on her. In the half-second pause that followed, Lou heard from Johnny all the doubt he'd ever felt inside of himself, but he appreciated the young man for swallowing his questions and choosing respectful silence. If he could replace his entire crew with Johnny duplicates, whether or not they were as competent as he wanted, then he'd be happy. Johnny could learn. Respect cannot be taught without damage. Yeah, sure thing, boss. I'll check on her first thing in the morning. No, Lou said it far more sternly than he'd intended. The blank, business-like poker face cracked. He'd allowed it to crack, hadn't paid enough attention to stop it, and a spurt of emotion leaked through. Check on her now, he said coldly enough that he hoped it would override the outburst. From the other end of the line came a second pause. I got so much other shit to do, Gramps. Look, you've already got me hustling for the fucking nutcases you let knock over Cause's joint. Why do I gotta check on your fucking broad, old man? Why can't you make it? Did you bust your hip bending over for your fucking garlic pills? In the 2 seconds of silence, he heard the griping, the groaning, the bitterness, but only from within. From without, Johnny finished his pause and said once more, Sure thing, boss. You need anything else? Lou shook his head, even though Johnny couldn't see him. No, Johnny. Let me know what you find. Even though it was less than Johnny deserved, Lou hung up the phone without saying anything else. It made him feel a little guilty, but it made him feel better, too. Johnny, December 12th, 2024.
Johnny sank back into the seat of his parked car and sighed. What a life. He checked his watch. 10:37. He puffed out his cheeks and sighed again. What a fucking life. He hadn't even had a chance to grab a proper cup of coffee, and now he was going to have to deal with that Jackie bitch again. Twice in a week. What a fucking life. Johnny withdrew his pack of smokes from his jacket. He rolled down the window and lit a cigarette, eyes closed as he pulled the smoke in and held it, then let it go. Fuck it. He'd pick up coffee from McDonald's. Maybe he'd get one for Jackie, too, since he was already an errand boy anyway. By the time he got to the apartment complex, he'd gone through half his pack and probably stank like Fidel Castro's asshole, but he was calmer. The coffee he'd bought for himself was already empty, so he only carried the one he bought for Jackie all the way up the stairs. Johnny didn't take the elevator despite how high up it was to her place and despite all the cigarettes. The cameras in the elevators bugged him, and he wanted the exercise. When he exited the stairwell and stepped into the hallway, Johnny was struck with a small, subtle recognition that something wasn't right. He couldn't determine what it was or why he felt that way, but he reached around and patted the waistband of his jeans for his gun. The .38 was still there. It made him feel safer. Walking down the hall with the McCafe, the sense of danger grew more acute.
He was still at a loss as to why until he reached the door to Jackie's apartment. The smell. Tangy, a little metallic, like your hand after handling a bunch of pennies. It hung in the damp air, tainted it with sour humidity. Johnny drew the snub-nosed revolver and placed the coffee on the floor. His brain ran through all of the possibilities, what he would find, how he should find it, how he should react, and with the gun drawn, so many floors up, he decided caution was the best approach. Whoever was in Jackie's apartment couldn't run, and if they tried, he could shoot the shit out of them. Johnny readied the gun and raised his free hand. He knocked. The door drifted open. It had been drawn so close to close that it had to be intentional. Whatever was in that apartment was meant to be found. The smell was sharp and unmistakable now, and the moment that Johnny stepped inside, its source was evident. He saw a dead Eddie, and he saw all the blood and the bugs, but the pool of his soul remained tranquil and undisturbed. With soft, deliberate steps, Johnny advanced, adjusting his grip on the revolver while he swept the space with his eyes. He didn't bother checking on Eddie. The old man was deader than dead. There was enough blood in the kitchen for two, though. Where was Jackie? Quick and calculated, Johnny swept through the apartment with no sign of the whore. He returned to the kitchen and stood above the dead captain, thumbing the hammer of his gun, processing the scene and the events leading up to it. Jackie couldn't do this. If she could have killed Eddie like this, she would have fucked Johnny up after he clocked her. And what about that unusual call from Lou? The boss always went through buffers. Every boss did. That's how this thing was still alive. And why would he ask Johnny to check on Jackie? He wasn't an errand boy. He was already working. This was some small-time shit. Johnny cursed to himself, holstered the gun back in his jeans, then closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He remembered the coffee and decided dead whores didn't drink coffee, so while his mind raced with how to handle this mess, he went in the hallway for it. The McCafe had vanished. Someone had stolen his coffee. The door to Jackie's apartment was open and the stink of murder wafted through the whole floor, and someone had stopped by to take the coffee. Johnny stopped and cursed again and checked the halls for the sack of shit who'd probably seen the mess inside, but they'd disappeared too. Fuck me, Christ, Johnny muttered, massaging his forehead. As far as he could see, he had no choice. Johnny hustled down the stairs, got into his car, and used the burner phone in his glove box to call the police. 911, what's your emergency? Said the dispatcher. There's been a murder, Johnny said. The dispatcher tried to stop him, tried to slow him down, tried to take control of the conversation, but Johnny steamrolled over the attempts with the details. He kept a calm, firm tone, told the dispatcher the location, the apartment, and who they would find. Then he hung up, tossed the phone under a tire, and backed over it. What a fucking life.
Deborah, December 12th, 2024.
She was up to her nose in work, but when Deborah heard about the dead, high-ranking friend in a prostitute's apartment, a tingle skittered from the base of her spine all the way up to her skull, and she nudged Freddie. "We're going to check it out," she told him. Freddy didn't argue. He didn't seem to bother anymore. He looked up from his mocha with forlorn eyes and asked, "You hear about that attack last night?" She shook her head, and Freddy looked away and sighed. The red Starbucks cup was poised beneath his nose as if he'd prepared to take a sip and then forgot. Deborah wondered if the weight of the world's madness was beginning to affect Freddy now. She imagined how it might seep in and how undefended his heart was compared to hers. While she believed it to be one of his greatest strengths, Freddy allowed himself to feel everything, and he felt it deeply. He did not brace, deflect, or protect himself from the perils of his fellow man. He had no fortresses, only encampments. It had always been that way, even in the war. Perhaps now, or perhaps soon, he would understand her process, her frustration, her viciousness. At last, he said, "It was like the Fred Meyer massacre, when he's a target this time." He said it as if he were putting something down for her to pick up. But she had been down that road with Hartigan, and the commissioner had made it abundantly clear: focus on Lucinda Love. That was what she planned to do. Eventually, she reasoned, pursuing the lead with the dead friend would bring her onto the Fred Meyer massacre case. The connection was obvious to Deborah. Copious blood, a gang hit, and a prostitute. All of it lined up with the Rolling Hills assault. The cases were connected, and Lucinda Love was connected to Rolling Hills. It was all the same case. She chose patience. It seemed time for a new approach anyway. The drive to the scene was done in silence. Freddy nursed his coffee and Deborah brooded. The radio yammered and she turned it off soon after turning it on. The apartment was a treasure trove of evidence, so much that it conflicted. In the blood there were 2 shoe prints. Cursory fingerprinting looked like a who's who of local friends' goons. The murderer had been messy, and the blood splatters suggested that there'd been 2 deaths. The missing comforter, the bloody knife, item after item was documented, photographed, and cataloged. There was so much to inspect that Deborah didn't even notice that Freddy had vanished until he appeared at her side with his hand on her elbow. "Deb," he muttered, speaking low, leaning close to her ear. "We've got some witnesses." Her eyes flashed. "That saw this?" Freddy shook his head. "They think they saw a guy taking a body away." He paused. Something seemed to hover anxiously over his expression, and his lips pressed together as he released something like a sigh through his nostrils. "The guy was big," he said at last. Deborah grinned, but then caught herself and stopped. Freddy eyed her knowingly, with the faintest trace of disdain. Things were not right between them. Nevertheless, Deborah understood the implication of Freddy's remark. She was one step closer to proving the connection. She could not understand why that didn't bring her partner the same joy it brought her. What was more, Deborah couldn't understand why he was so persistent in his attempts to make her feel ashamed of that joy. The trajectory of the case spread before her mind's eye almost as a reverie. They could solve all of it, she thought. They had a chance to fix it all. Why was that so bad? Excellent. That's great news. Did you get anything else out of them? He grimaced, or maybe it was a flinch. They're afraid. They don't want to say anything else. Deborah didn't grin this time, even though she badly wanted to. Freddy's kick-dog expression was a result of this conundrum. His charm, his smooth-talking kumbaya horseshit wasn't working like he'd hoped, and he needed her to turn the screws. That was okay. Even on the right side of history, there were good guys and bad guys. Deborah was getting used to being the bad guy. The witnesses were a few college kids, 2 roommates and a girlfriend who spent the night. It was early enough on their schedule that none of the 3 had gotten out of their pajamas, and the boys wore baggy basketball shorts and the girl wore a Nirvana shirt that was far, far too big to be hers. Between the 3 of them, she seemed to be running the show. She sat on the couch with her legs up on the cushion and crossed beneath her, her face turned defiantly away from the officers in the room. She held her arms across her chest like a gate barring entry. The young men did the best they could to follow suit, though they did so with far less conviction. 3 uniformed officers stood in their living room, each armed with a notepad and impatience. Before stepping into the room, Deborah pulled a dazzling smile across her face. She was hardening, but she hadn't forgotten how to be charming, too. "Hi," she oozed, aiming her sunbeam smile and outstretched hand at the young woman. "I'm Deborah Samson. You can call me Deb if you like." The young woman seemed taken aback, likely from a combination of Deborah's sex and the aggressive cheerfulness of the approach. She took the offered hand in a meek, hesitant grip, which was received by Deborah's strong shake. Their gazes met, and a spark flew like a tiger locking eyes with a deer, but Deborah's smile was very convincing and her voice so sweet that the woman said, "I'm Valerie." "So good to meet you, Valerie. Who are your boys?" Valerie glanced at the young men flanking her on the couch and seemed amused by Deborah's description of them. "This is one of my people," her body seemed to say as the tension in her shoulders uncoiled. When her arms did not recross after Deborah gave Valerie her hand back, it seemed to add, "This is a woman, and we're the same." "This is Dan," she said, looking to the one on the left. "He's my boyfriend, and this is Eric." As their names were called in turn, each of the 2 gave Deborah a furtive glance. They didn't seem as relaxed as Valerie. Eric seemed to tense up even more. "It's nice to meet all of you," Deborah replied. "You met Detective Plum before, correct?" "Yes, he already interviewed us."
"We said what we have to say," Eric grumbled. He ran his fingers through his hair. His hand was shaking. Not much, but enough. Lightning shot through Deborah, but she ultimately ignored the boy. She kept her gaze on Valerie. "I hoped we could get some things clarified. I'm in charge of the investigation." It wasn't entirely true, but that premise, a strong woman heading the homicide investigation, seemed to make something click inside Valerie. The same sort of resonance she likely had with Wonder Woman and female politicians. Deborah leaned on it. "I'd like to ask you some questions, Valerie. I hope you'll cooperate." Valerie tucked her hair behind her ear and shifted on the couch. Her legs uncoiled from beneath her slender body and her feet came all the way down to the floor. "Sure, I can help." 2 of the officers, men, gave Deborah an intrigued glance. The 3rd, a woman, puckered her lips like she'd been sucking on pickled plums. "Do you know what happened last night?" Valerie shook her head. "Not exactly." "A woman was murdered last night. She was one of the neighbors, apartment 409. Did you know her?" "I don't live here." Freddy took the opportunity to slide in. "Do either one of you guys know her?" Dan tensed at the mention of the woman in apartment 409, but Eric nodded. "I've seen her around,"
Do you know her name? Eric shook his head and rubbed the stubble on his jaw.
She's kind of unfriendly.
Deborah addressed Valerie. Did you three see anything strange last night? She took a mental note of Dan, who seemed to be made even more uncomfortable by this question than the last one. Eric looked at Valerie, who hesitated. Deborah pushed. You did, didn't you? Valerie opened her mouth to say something, but Eric snapped.
Valerie, we don't know anything.
She flicked her fingernails against each other and sucked her tongue. Deborah shrugged. You guys aren't going to get in trouble for seeing something. In fact, if it turns out to be helpful, you have no idea how grateful we'll be. How grateful Jackie's parents will be. That was her name. Jackie. Whoever killed her sprayed her blood all over the place. It's a mess, Valerie. It's going to destroy her parents. Beside the couch, out of the young three's view, Freddie placed his hand over his mouth. The officers stiffened, but the college kids didn't seem to notice. All eyes were on Deborah. With her audience captive, she continued. You know what will get you in trouble, though? Withholding evidence. If you don't talk to us, you're aiding this murderer in the evasion of the police. May as well have given him a getaway car. She crossed her arms to solidify the bluff. She'd scare these kids straight. If you cooperate, even if you are doing something wrong, I can promise we'll turn a blind eye to it. She angled her face as if she were eyeing the three of them with suspicion. Unless, of course, you didn't actually see anything and you're wasting my time, and this is a cover. Eric turned his head.
What would it be a cover for?
Deborah shrugged. You guys seem to know the time Jackie was killed. That's strange.
You're trying to scare us.
A vicious, hungry grin spread over Deborah's face. Is it working? Dan spoke at last.
He was driving a van.
The others snapped their gaze at him, and he raised his hands in defense.
It's working on me, guys, and I don't owe that dude anything. I don't know what your problem is, guys. You don't talk to cops, Dan, snarled Eric. What is this, The Sopranos? Holy crap, guys, the girl in the apartment down the hall is dead. Put the politics down.
Dan turned to Deborah.
I thought he was drunk. He slipped a bit on the ice. I shouted at him to see if he was okay, and he said he was. Just in case, I got some pictures with my phone. I couldn't get a good one of him, and it was too dark to get the license plate, but in case there was an accident, I wanted something.
Deborah asked, Can I see it? Dan nodded and took his phone out of his gym shorts.
Deborah extended a hand to take it, but he only held it up so that she could see the picture. She was a little amused that he didn't offer it to her. She repeated the question. Dan stared at her strangely, a little taken aback for a few moments. He looked at her hand, still outstretched, then at her, and then at last seemed to understand. After a brief hesitation, he handed her the phone. Deborah saw the van, and she saw the man. It was only a glimpse. He was on the opposite side of the van, and his face, viewed through the dirty windows, was half cast in shadows. The glimpse was enough, though. He fit the general description of the kind of man who had attacked the Fred Meyer and the strip club. It was a start, a foothold that she could use to scale the rest of the cliff face. She could do something with a start. Long ago, Deborah had learned that, like war, police work was a game of inches. Very rarely did one find the big, dramatic lead, the heavy, heart-pounding wrecking ball of epiphany. They were little realizations. Every step to the truth was a small one. She met Dan's eyes and said, "I need this. Do you have more?"
There was a brief struggle to get the pictures, resistance which came from the other two, not Dan. Deborah wondered what could have happened the night before if those two hadn't been with Dan. They seemed passionate and purposeful in their disinterest. They focused so much energy on not getting involved. They didn't have anything to hide. Of that, Deborah was certain. These kids didn't have the spine to do anything worth hiding. Instead, their rebellion came from a place of ideology that Deborah simply didn't understand. And as she and Freddie got in the car to pursue the van lead, she recognized that she didn't care to understand it either. They were obstacles, and there was nothing else to know. Dan was a savior, and he'd likely never know it. Deborah marveled at the luck, wondering how many lives the young man had saved by simply bending and doing the right thing. It was such a small thing, the right thing, and so simple and so difficult, too. Deborah marveled at that as well, but she didn't spend nearly as much time on it. The pictures of the big black Chevy were more than enough to get started. How many people drove these things anymore? None, she could imagine. They were tainted by a certain type of person associated with a particular constellation of sins. Behind the wheel of her Olds, Deborah beamed as she steered her and Freddie back to the station. The moment she'd slammed the car door shut, before she'd even turned on the ignition, her phone came out and her fingers traced across the pad to the number for the station. It was one of the few numbers she had memorized. She called in a request for all the traffic camera footage in a 5-mile radius from around Jackie's predicted time of death. "What are we looking for?" asked Chuck from the lab. "An 87 Chevy Beauville, black." Deborah released the words on the wind of a breathy half-sigh, half-laugh that was so apparently full of relief that Chuck chuckled a little too, although it was plain that he didn't know why. Freddie seemed to understand, though, and while the excitement and fury and beautiful white-hot surge of justice flooded his face too, it was not with the accompanying tinge of relief. Instead, Freddie seemed oddly distant and a little tense. Deborah's attempts to stoke the fire in his belly were met with flaccid, forced responses, automated, thoughtless echoes of that which Deborah hunted. When they hit the freeway, Deborah accelerated mindlessly. The engine growled louder and louder, the air whipped around the sedan with the furious snarls, and she weaved the vehicle in and out of what was left of the morning rush. Like a feather, or like the soft reminder of conscience, Freddie's hand touched Deborah's arm. He spoke her name, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it before, and it summoned her back into place. It was as if she had been out of her body, occupying the ethereal plane of daydream and discourse, tethered to this world only by the invisible string which connected her to Freddie. Deborah was aware again of the car and the freeway and the speedometer, and without any further direction, she lightened her push on the gas, and they slowed down. She grit her teeth and squeezed the steering wheel tight. "Deborah," Freddie said her name again, but his voice was not so soft anymore. Instead, it was laced with tendrils of deep concern, and she could feel his eyes bearing down on her, but she refused to meet them. She kept her gaze locked on the road in front of her. He said it again, and she could hear her teeth grind against each other and felt as if her jaw might snap. Freddie continued. "What are you going to do when we find him?" After a strange falter that Deborah couldn't really explain, she answered, "I'm going to bring him to justice." Out of her peripherals, she thought she saw Freddie frown, and he faltered too, almost opening his mouth to speak, but choosing instead to look at the road. He let out a sigh, and Deborah knew that he understood, and that his understanding made him disappointed. It broke her heart, but she decided not to care. Before they got to the station, Deborah stopped to get gas, and before she stepped out of the car, she got a call from Chuck. He sent her a dossier which she pored over on her phone as she pumped fuel into the tank. The van had a Washington state license plate, number WRT9945, and it was last registered to George Schick, serving time in Clallam Bay. They put an APB out on the vehicle, and it inadvertently became the number one priority when word got around that it was possibly associated with the 2 recent attacks on the grocery store. No one seemed particularly impressed that the 2 were directly linked to the murder of at least one young woman. Deborah told herself it was because the grocery store shootings were more localized to a broader audience. She pushed it out of her mind that it was because Jackie had been a whore, like Lucinda. She was not sure which was more true, but she reminded herself that it was an irrelevant quandary to pursue at the moment. They would catch the man who'd killed them both, and he would lead them to the others, and Deborah would be able to put an end to the whole thing, to exorcise the creatures which lurked in the great slouching darkness and terrorized her city's dreams. She would be able to go home and hold Shaylee with pride and the reassurance that all the nights she wasn't there to help her with homework, all the days she hadn't been able to join her and Adam at the park, all the minutes that had been shaved into hours and days, stolen away from the ones she loved, had been dedicated to something worthwhile, and that she would be validated in making the choices she made. Perhaps her desire was potent enough to affect the whole world. Perhaps that need for validation sent such powerful ripples through the fabric of the universe that it, or God, or some other benevolent intelligence chose to heed it. Or perhaps it was mere coincidence that Deborah pulled into the same gas station where out stepped the man from Dan's photos, a 6-pack of Heineken in one hand and a bag of beef jerky in the other. Her heart stopped for a moment. She wasn't certain if she was dreaming. It was impossible, wasn't it? The coincidence was too tremendous. What were the chances? More than astronomical. They were... Deborah was still recovering from her shock when she drew her pistol and shouted the name that Mary had given them. "Bartu!" she roared, the life and strength of all those desires erupting from her throat, wrapping together like threads of a rope into something greater and stronger and more manifest. It took the man a beat longer to respond than she'd anticipated. She was already advancing on him when his face registered that he heard his name, and the expression that he made even before he looked at Deborah was one of great and deep shock. "Bartu, you're under arrest. Put down the food, hands on your head, kiss the concrete." Almost. She was almost on him. She had him right here. Deborah was oblivious to the panic around her, oblivious to the danger posed by drawing a gun at a gas station. The world melted away and left only her desire. Bartu, serial murderer, right in front of her. But despite the strength of her desire and the roar of her will, Bartu did not drop the jerky and the beer, put his hands on his head, or lay on the ground. He threw the cardboard carrier at her like a missile. It narrowly missed her head. There was a series of pops when the glass bottles exploded on the ground. There were screams. Deborah didn't remember firing, but she must have, because Bartu didn't run away. He couldn't, because he was clutching his bleeding leg, and everyone who was still at the gas station fell to the ground on their stomachs, hands over their heads, whimpering. It didn't occur to Deborah just how fortunate she was that she hadn't hit the pump Bartu stood beside, or how impossible it was that the entire place hadn't erupted into flames. Perhaps she could chalk that up to the power of her will, too. The shooting, though dangerous, was justified. If she had stopped then, there would be no ensuing consequence aside from the slap on the wrist, perhaps a few days of leave, and then a commendation. Deborah would be a hero. But Deborah did not stop there. The power of her will had brought her to Bartu, and like it had with Peaches, it brought her wrath down upon him too. She kicked his ribs and his jaw, stomped her boot against the wound in his leg, and raised the pistol to point at his chest. Freddie pulled her away. He bound her arms to her side with his own, and she could not remember him being this strong before. Through gritted teeth, he growled, calm down, Deborah, calm down." Freddie said it over and over again, like a mantra, like an affirmation, like he was projecting his own will into the universe to make it bend, too. She did calm down eventually, and he took the gun from her and led her to the passenger seat of her own car, which would have normally enraged her, but she was so focused on Bartu that it was nothing. "Don't let him get away. Cuff him, you fuck." "You shot his leg and beat the shit out of him," Freddie snarled back. "He's not going anywhere." She leaned over the driver's seat, got the radio, and called for backup. Deborah tried to get out of the car, but Freddie grabbed her arm. It hurt and pulled her back down. "No," he rumbled. "Stay here. You can't handle this right now. I'm not going to pretend like things are okay anymore. Sit down, stay there, and don't move. I'll get him." And he did. Deborah watched the scene unfold with agonizing slowness. Freddie ran his fingers through his hair and shook his head as he approached Bartu, who didn't move. Was he dead? The thought struck Deborah like an arrow through the heart. He couldn't be dead. She couldn't have fucked up that badly that he was dead. Freddie leaned over the body and his mouth moved as he flipped Bartu over. The man put his hands behind his back. The tension of waiting slipped out of Deborah's muscles, and for the second time today, she felt overwhelmed with relief. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the headrest, allowing herself a little smile. It was over. Freddie put the cuffs on Bartu and shot Deborah a look of abhorrence. She didn't see it. Hartigan came into the observation room with a caddy of coffee cups. He offered one to Deborah and Freddie, and they accepted.
"Has he said anything?"
Hartigan asked, and then took a sip of his coffee. He knew the answer already, of course. After a background check from his fingerprints, the man had been identified as Patrick Hurst, 32 years old, 4 priors. Armed robbery, soliciting a prostitute, 2 domestic violence charges. Hurst refused to acknowledge any statement directed at him, either during the present interrogation or when his wounds were seen to by a doctor. In the big, blank room on the other side of the two-way mirror, he turned his head away from the interrogators or stared at his knuckles, tracing the ridges of his palms and fingers, eyes so distant and preoccupied with other matters that it was evident that he wasn't in the room with the interrogators and his body. Deborah wanted in. She could make him talk. She shot daggers through the two-way mirror and let the hate fill her heart. If she was let in with him, she could break his spirit, decimate the facade of stoicism, grind his toxic will into dust. Deborah thought about the women he'd killed and the troop of monsters still lurking in the shadows, and she wanted Hurst dead. Worse than dead. She wanted justice. After about 10 minutes or so of questions that went nowhere, Hurst raised his face out of the shadows, allowing the pale, artificial light of the fluorescent tube above to illuminate it. His pronounced brow still enshadowed his eyes, but it was evident that they remained on his hands. When Hurst finally opened his mouth and let the low, rough rumble of his words rattle off his lips, he said, "My name is Bartu." The detectives in the observation room were silent, as was the interrogator inside. The first thing the man had said, and it was denying his identity. Deborah studied the bright, shining skin of his naked scalp, following the line of its shape down to the crevices of his brow, searching for clues. He was clearly insane. Either that or the group was part of a cult. Deborah had heard about the change of identity happening in other cults. It was ridiculous that he would deny it still. Deborah didn't understand. The interrogator folded her hands together on the table and leaned forward. "Pardon?" she asked. The whites of Hurst's eyes had the same shocking emptiness of color as sun-bleached bone, for when he raised them to shoot the woman in the room with a glare, Deborah could see them plainly despite the shadows and distance. The rest of Hurst's body was completely still. Only those eyes shifted. He repeated, "My name is Bartu." The interrogator sat back and gave her chin a thoughtful stroke. Deborah knew her. She was Ice Queen Detective Rhonda Thatcher, who ruled with the scepter of her sharpened tongue. She could play both the good cop and the bad one and understood the machinations of desire well enough that she could draw the truth from a stone. Deborah trusted her. She knew her job. But here, she had no place. She did not share the room with a man. She shared the room with a monster. Deborah's skepticism was confirmed when Rhonda fed Hurst's delusion. "What do you mean?" "It means exactly that. My name is Bartu." Rhonda opened the manila folder before her and shuffled through the dossier inside. She put on a very confused face. "I don't understand. It says here that you're Patrick, Mr. Patrick Hurst." He dropped his gaze back to the metal table and shook his head with a sliver of movement. "It doesn't say anything about Bartu in here." Deborah clenched her teeth. Thatcher was losing him. "Who is Patrick Hurst?" Thatcher had his eyes again. His mouth opened slow and he said, "Patrick Hurst is dead. I killed him." "You killed him?" "Temujin helped me kill Patrick Hurst." "Temujin?" Hurst seemed to realize that he'd revealed too much and clammed up again. It was going to be a long interrogation at the pace that Thatcher went. On the other side of the mirror, Deborah said, "Let me in." She said it as if she were speaking to the room, though the command was directed at Hartigan. Freddie and Hartigan both turned to her, although it took Freddie a little longer. There was a span of silence, and just before Deborah was about to speak, Hartigan turned away from her and said, "No." Deborah didn't have a chance to fly into moral outrage. Hartigan pressed on, driving his words into the air with the soft, deliberate work of a very sharp knife.
Detective Samson, your passion is normally one of the things which I admire most about you. However, in recent events, it has been the cause of some very serious errors in your judgment.
Again, Deborah tried to speak, but Hartigan held up his hand and pressed forward with the same calm urgency.
Samson, please let me speak. I have nothing but respect for you, so this is very hard for me, and I need you to let me speak.
He didn't wait, likely because he knew that he couldn't. The moment that he stopped, she would wedge herself in and plow through. He said,
Throughout the course of your investigation, I have received multiple reports of unacceptable behavior ranging from intimidation of witnesses to outright violence against suspects. This most recent event with Hearst, vicious, escalated, undeniable, forces me to set aside my doubts regarding previous allegations and place you on administrative leave effective immediately.
Deborah shot a hideous glare at Freddie, who had turned away from her and studied the interrogation before them. Thatcher asked Hearst about Temujin and Bartu, and Freddie took notes on a little flip pad. Deborah was aware of the conversation in the interrogation room, but only to the extent that it was happening and not any of its details, so she was unaware if Freddie's fervent scribbling was for show or if the information was truly pressing. It didn't matter either way. The interrogation was recorded, and he'd have access to it later. Right now, she needed him, and Freddie's pointed lack of attention was all the evidence Deborah needed to pin the blame on him. He'd put her in this situation. He'd told Hartigan. She'd thought she could trust him in foxholes of every kind, but Freddie had let her down, and now he wasn't even man enough to look at her while she reaped what he'd sown. So furious was Deborah that she didn't acknowledge Hartigan's reprimand. She retreated into herself and didn't even hear him ask if she'd heard him until he put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, took a reflexive step back, flinging her gaze at Hartigan. He flinched and stepped back, too.
Do you understand, Detective Samson?
Deborah watched the man who called himself Bartu and clenched her fist. No good deed went unpunished. Hartigan repeated,
Detective Samson.
Yeah. She dropped her gaze, and her mouth twisted around like she was preparing to spit. She put her hands on her hips and stood there, silent for a moment.
Detective.
What? What else do you want to say?
Hartigan held out his hand. Your gun and badge, Detective Samson.
Deborah ran her fingers through her hair, and her upper lip twitched into a momentary snarl. She fidgeted and took a step towards nothing, prolonging the despair, holding it off for as long as she could. Hartigan addressed her once more.
Detective Samson.
His tone hardened like steel cooling in a die-cast mold, and Deborah knew that her time was up. He would not say it with such generosity or kindness again. She took the gun out of the holster and thrust it at Hardigan, handle first, barrel in her hand, and pointed at her chest. She locked eyes with the big man as if she were daring him to pull the trigger, to finish the betrayal, but he took it from her gingerly, meeting her hateful gaze with one that was sad, soft, and disappointed. Then he held out his other hand and waited for the badge. Deborah's nostrils flared, but she unhooked it from her belt and thrust it at him too. Hardigan nodded.
Thank you. Please go home and wait.
Don't let him get away, Deborah growled. Don't let any of them get away or I'll never forgive you. She noticed that Freddie still hadn't turned to face her, and so she addressed him now, speaking louder this time. You hear that? Don't let them get away, Detective Plum. He met Deborah's gaze with hard, sharp eyes that startled her. I won't, Detective Samson, and I'll do it the right way. In the interrogation room, the man who called himself Bartu asked for a lawyer, and Detective Thatcher nodded. If you think you need one, she said. Deborah pushed past the two men, her face wreathed in anguished, hateful lines. On the drive home, Deborah anticipated a surprise cheer from Shaylee and the grouchy but pleased rumble of Adam's voice asking why she was back so soon. She played the scene out in her head, fantasizing about it in 1,000 different ways, devising a repertoire of witty responses to all of the possible ways that her father might greet her. Like a cool salve, it eased the pain of the overall situation, and armed with those fantasies, Deborah was able to stay grateful and calm. What she had not anticipated was meeting Adam in the stairwell with bags in his hands, and, judging by his expression, he hadn't planned on encountering Deborah either. The two of them froze on their respective landing, eyes locked on the others across the flight of stairs between them. Adam broke gaze first, clearing his throat and shifting on his feet. He adjusted his grip on the suitcase handles and started walking down the stairs, eyes averted, focusing on each step ahead of him. Deborah reached out and placed a hand on his chest. Where are you going? Where's Shaylee? You're home early? Where's Shaylee? Adam looked at the wall ahead of him and sucked on his tongue. He took a deep breath, and just as Deborah was going to ask again, he said, I'm surprised you're home at all, Debbie. You're never home. I'm surprised you remember the way back sometimes. I love you, girl, and Shaylee loves you. But this ain't good for either one of us. Shaylee and I need to move on. Pop, where is Shaylee? That little girl's heart gets broken every night, you know that? She come ask me every night, is Auntie Deb coming home tonight? And I go tell her, I don't know, Sugar Pop. I'm sure she's out for a good reason, though. You know that, Debbie? I have that conversation with her every night. Pop, you're not seriously... Adam nodded. I am. We're headed out. We're gonna get out of your way, girl, so you can live your life, and so Shaylee can live hers, too. Deborah balked. You're taking her away because I missed dinner? Adam shook his head. I'm taking her away because of the men that come. Deborah swallowed hard. Adam must have seen the question in her eyes because she didn't remember asking it before he explained. Oh, yeah, he said, bobbing his head in furious affirmation. Oh, yeah, there's been men that come knocking on the door asking for you. I seen their tap around. I remember some of them from Susanna's crew. Deborah some time to process what Adam had just told her. Peaches. Peaches' men had come looking for her. They'd come to leave a message. She swallowed again and asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" "When could I do that, Deb?" A furious tangle formed across Adam's brow. "I tried staying up, waiting for you to come back at night, but by the time you got here, I got so goddamn tired I didn't know even how to say it. And that's only been when I can stay up, girl, and what the hell you gonna do, anyhow?" "Pop, I made a mistake." "Goddamn right you did." Adam's head bobbed angrily again. "Goddamn right, girl, you goddamn right about that." "Where are you going to stay?" "Some fellas from the church offered to keep us." That was all he said. Deborah waited, and Adam didn't offer anything more. "Where?" "You got my cell number, Debbie. You call me when you fix this mess." "Can I say goodbye to Shaylee?" Adam's face tightened, and the muscles of his jaw pushed against the skin of his face. He looked away again. "She's already at the house," he said. "It's too late." "Pop." "Debbie, I raised you right. I raised you good and Christian. You still wear that cross I gave you. I ever tell you that used to be my cross? It was. It was a low thing to carry that cross and do what you did to that nasty pimp." Adam's eyes widened. "Oh, yeah, Debbie, he was one of them that come knocking on the door, his arm and face a mess. I don't fault him a moment for hating you. No matter how ugly his heart and soul is, you done an ugly thing to him. I didn't raise you like that, girl. I raised you right." Adam picked up the suitcase with a groan. "I don't know who you are now. Maybe after this is over and you done what you had to do, we can meet this new woman you become, but until then, Shaylee and I are just gonna have to do our own thing." He took the bags and turned his back to Deborah, who merely stood and watched him continue down the stairwell until he disappeared, and then she stood and listened to the sound of his footsteps until they were no more. She didn't know what else she could do. She had no badge, no gun, and no power. Deborah stood in the stairwell for a little time afterwards, resting the back of her head against the wall, her eyes closed. She tried taking deep breaths, and she tried to reflect, tried to suppress the tremendous fury that rose inside her, but it was no use. Eventually, the fury left her, but it left her the way that a long, burning fire fades. The powerful dance of orange heat simmered down to tiny tongues, which crawled into embers, and soon after, even those red coals died into cold, gray ashes. The truth was, Deborah was too tired to be angry anymore. It was still only early afternoon and she was done. There was no more fuel to keep her going. At last, she opened her eyes, pushed herself off of the wall, and made her way up to the stairwell. She found her way to the apartment and did her best to ignore how empty it seemed without Adam and Shaylee. Deborah almost made it to the couch, resisting the urge to check in on their bedrooms, but the need was too great. The vague, intangible change in the air, the shift in odor, the difference in pressure and flow from then to now drove her morbid curiosity to the threshold of Shaylee's room. Most of her things were still there, which Deborah had expected, but it was a blow to see the little girl's most precious things missing. On the bed, spread lazily over the pillows. There should have been an old stuffed bear wearing overalls. And the stack of beginner's chapter books, which normally occupied the bedside table, was equally absent. Here and there throughout the apartment were holes in Deborah's life. Some of them had been previously filled by things she'd never really noticed until discovering their absence. The big coffee mug fashioned out of glazed clay, which Deborah had bought for Adam's birthday years ago. The quilt that Grandma had made for Susanna when she was little. The coats normally hanging on the door by hooks. It occurred to Deborah that she couldn't remember the last time she was home without either Adam or Shaylee being there too. That was a devastating realization. Deborah collapsed on the couch and did her best to think about anything else.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoyed the story, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. If you want to go deeper, ever wondered what your favorite story reveals about your psychology? I offer story shadow readings where I analyze what your chosen narrative says about your inner patterns and growth edges. I also do psychological tarot readings focused on shadow work and pattern recognition rather than predictions. Links to both services are in the description if you're curious about what insights might emerge. For ongoing support, you can find me on Patreon or buy my books on Amazon. I've linked to both in the description. You can connect with me on Instagram or Threads at Nightmares and Grief. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.